Hi, everyone. Good morning. Hope you're having a good conference so far. I'm Madhura Bhave, and I'm on the Spring Boot team with Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Webb. I'm the current lead of Spring Boot.
And today we're going to be talking about Spring Boot 2.0. This year the team's been focusing a lot on the next major release, 2.0. So we're going to go over some of the things that are new. So this is what the agenda roughly looks like. We'll go over what's new, what's changed, and what's changed, but also what's evolving. So since we're in milestones currently, things might change a little more. So we've called that section what's evolving.
Can I have a quick show of hands? Who's currently using Spring 1.5? Is anyone trying the milestones yet on 2.0? OK, a few, not many. Cool, thanks.
Right, so let's get started. So what's new? One of the big themes in Spring Boot 2.0 is Spring Framework 5, which just went GA a few months ago. And infrastructure updates. So with every major release, we get the opportunity to do a few changes to our underlying infrastructure, and we're going to talk about those in some detail.
So, yeah, as Madhura said, that we don't get an opportunity to raise the baseline versions for things that often, and a major release gives us a good opportunity to do that. So if you're using Spring Boot 2, you're going to need a minimum of Java 8. Hopefully that's not an issue for people these days. I think Java 7 is end of life now anyway. We're also upgrading a few of the libraries. So Tomcat, the minimum version we'll support is 8. We're going to upgrade to Hibernate 5.2. And TimeLeaf 3 is going to be the minimum TimeLeaf version. A little bit about Spring Framework 5 as well. So has anyone played with Spring Framework 5 yet? A little bit? Or are you sort of waiting for the Boot 2 release? Yeah, sorry. Boot 2 should be ready, we think, around the end of February. So GA should be around the end of February. But Spring Framework 5 is already GA. And it introduces quite a lot of new features. The first one we want to talk about is the reactive Spring support. So if you're currently a Spring MVC developer, you're probably used to a situation like this, where you have like a client making a call, going to the server, maybe you're talking to one database. You kind of get this request response per thread model. And this works relatively well, but as I've mentioned in the keynote, it can kind of fall apart a little bit if you've got requests that take some time to run. So when you compare it to Reactive Spring is really about efficiency. So here's an example of a mobile client calling the server. Maybe you've got more backends now. Maybe you've got things that are a little bit slower to call. Maybe you're doing more coordination. Or maybe you've got more clients actually kind of hitting your service. Maybe those clients are slower. These are the kind of areas where a reactive stack really shines. And if you don't have one, you may find your data center looking like this. So blocking, I said, really is about having a thread pool, so multiple threads, each thread handling a request one at a time. Whereas non-blocking is about having a small group of threads, normally one per core, and each thread kind of processes an event and then lets go of it as soon as any kind of blocking I/O needs to happen. The difference between the reactive stack and the servlet stack is, so we have like servlet containers. Am I cutting out?
Yeah.
Do you want to carry on?
Right, so in the Spring world, the difference between the reactive stack and the servlet stack is somewhat like this. So in the servlet stack, we have your underlying servlet containers such as Tomcat, Jetty, Undertow, etc. And then above that, we have the blocking servlet API and then a web framework such as Spring MVC. But when you come to the non-blocking world, we now have support for the new asynchronous runtime Netty. So you can also run Tomcat and Jetty on, in the non-blocking stack, but that will use the servlet 3.1 non-blocking components. And on top of that, we have the reactive HTTP layer, which is, it's I think it's sort of like an adapter to the Reactive Streams API that's been built. And then the web framework that sits on top of that is Spring WebFlux. So that's a completely non-blocking reactive stack that you see down there.
Can you hear me now? Is it still? Okay. So Project Reactor, if you don't know, is built on this thing called Reactive Streams. So Reactive Streams is a sort of, I want to say a standard, but a collection, a loose collection of people got together and came up with this API called Reactive Streams. And Project Reactor is an implementation of that. The two types that you're mainly going to need to get familiar with are mono, which represents one item, or flux, which represents a stream of potentially infinite number of items. I think we have a quick demo.
Yes, so let's move to the demo. So what I have here, I'm not going to do live coding here. We have a list of commits that are already lined up. You can also find them on GitHub. We'll share the code at the end. So I'm going to start with the initial commit, starting with Spring MVC, and then slowly move up to a fully non-blocking reactive stack so that you can see the difference in how the thread model changes.
Can you see that okay? Is that too
I
bigger?
can.
Okay. Bit bigger?
Bigger, okay. Sorry.
Oh, thanks.
Is that okay? Right, so in this initial commit, we have in our pom.xml, we can see that the dependencies, they're using just the plain old Spring Boot Starter Web, which you're already familiar with, and that uses Spring MVC, and by default, it will run with Tomcat. And then for the data repository, we're using MongoDB. So we're using the Spring Boot Starter Data MongoDB. If I run this application, the app itself is a simple Spring Boot application. So what it does is it has this Spring Boot application annotation. It has one controller which is mapped to the city's endpoint. And that gets the data from the repository. So if we look at the repository just really quickly, that is your standard Spring Data repository, which extends the CRUD repository for city. So let's go ahead and start the application. As part of the startup, I'm just saving a bunch of cities to an embedded MongoDB. And if you can, how do I increase the font for this thing?
I don't know, I'm an Eclipse user. Sorry. Eclipse doesn't give you that option.
If I go to presentation view, okay, let me try that. Yeah. Control scroll. No, that doesn't work. That's weird. Let me try. That won't increase the font size of the console. Sorry, I didn't.
We can sort of describe what's going on.
Yeah, okay, let's just describe what's going on. Okay, so if you see here, I'll try and highlight it. The application is starting on Tomcat on port 8080 because it's a Spring MVC application, so by default it will use Tomcat. And I'm going to clear this log and make a request to our cities controller. And as you can see, we get back the JSON array of the cities that we've stored in the embedded MongoDB. Just a quick look at this log over here. So because it's a blocking standard Spring MVC application, it's a thread per request model. So it's just this one thread will serve the request from start to finish. But now, what I'm going to do instead is change the Spring data repository that we've been using to a reactive MongoDB repository. And what that'll do is this city repository that we can see here, it's now extending a reactive CRUD repository. So the cities controller, instead of returning just a regular list of cities, it's now returning this thing called Flux of city. And Flux is a publisher from the project Reactor, which is an implementation of the Reactive Streams publisher. So if I run the application now, it's still using Spring MVC, but it's using Spring MVC with a reactive data repository. So we're going to see a difference in the thread model here. So running this, the app still starts up on Tomcat because Spring MVC is in use. But if I make a request to the cities controller, still get back the same result. But as you can see here, we started off with our Tomcat thread. I hope you can see that. And then it switches to the Servlet 3.0 async API. So Spring MVC will see that the controller is returning a flux. So it's going to subscribe to that flux. And what you can see here is it's saying on subscribe. And then it says leave the request unbounded, so give me all the elements. And then what you see here is the thread to your MongoDB, which is going to fetch all the data. Because it's a reactive MongoDB, you can see that it's doing the on next, and then at the end, once it gets all the elements, it sends a complete signal. And then the Servlet 3.0 async API will dispatch back to the original thread here.
So what you're getting here is a kind of mixed model. You're able to use the kind of reactive types, but Spring MVC is kind of taking care of marshalling between threads. You're not completely non-blocking all the way.
Right. And then if you want to move to a completely non-blocking stack, what you need to do is switch from Spring MVC to Spring WebFlux. So here now we're using the Spring Boot Starter WebFlux and running that. The application now won't start up on Tomcat by default because Spring Boot Starter WebFlux uses Netty by default. So if you can see here, it started Netty on port 8080. And again, if we curl our cities endpoint, same result, but you can see that there's no like switching between the Servlet 3.0 async, how it went from one thread and then dispatched back to the Tomcat thread. It's just like goes to the Mongo thread, and once it gets the complete signal, it's done. So there's no kind of thread dance going on when you switch to a completely non-blocking stack. The last thing in this demo I want to quickly show is how, with Project Reactor, you get like a bunch of operators that can be applied to your Flux or Mono. Mono is, like Phil said before, it's a publisher dedicated to giving you a single element, while Flux will give you a collection of elements or a stream of elements. And what I've done here is just some basic operators on this Flux. So we get all the cities from our repository and then filter based on the country. Since we're in the USA, I filtered by USA. And then we just get the name of the city that we want. So quickly running that. This is the result. So since we've mapped the city to just get the name, we no longer get the entire city object, we just get the names of the cities that have been filtered by country USA.
There's me. Yeah, so I think this is just to summarize really the difference between reactive Spring and regular Spring is the kind of non-blocking all the way down, event-driven at the center. And also, don't really think about reactive Spring as giving you more speed. It really isn't about like raw throughput. If you've got a classic servlet application, more often than not, you can find that's faster. It really is about the scalability that comes in, especially when you've got these requests that are doing I/O or kind of slow. So Spring Framework 5 is also introducing a new API, an alternative to WebMVC. It's called the Functional Routing Service, and it allows you to declare through methods and callbacks the routes that you want. So this is just a brief example here. You can see we have like a GET request that's being mapped to a person and an ID, and then the Lambda is doing the callback. So it effectively just calls that and gives you the request. And again, like with the other functions, you can kind of chain things together and declare multiple routes in one kind of block of code. Anything you want to add to that? Anything you want to add to that?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I think the functional API plays nicely with the functional style reactive programming too, so.
Spring Framework 5 also has got Kotlin support. So if you're interested in trying Kotlin, you can just use the Spring dependency as you always would, and there are certain functions that are provided for you. So the documentation, I think, has got a great deal of detail about the various Kotlin extensions that we offer. If you're not using Kotlin, you can they just kind of get ignored, so it doesn't matter that the classes are there, they're just kind of ignored by Java.
Right, so that was just an overview of some of the things that are new in Spring Framework 5 and Spring Boot 2.0. But this release is not just about getting new things. Because it's a major release, it actually gives us a chance to go back and redo some of the things that we think maybe weren't quite how we wanted them in 1.x. So we've gone and changed a few parts of Spring Boot, and most of these, I think they've got quite a bit of an overhaul. And what we hope it'll give us is in the future, because we've now got them to a point where we're happy with it, it'll give us a nice foundation to build our future releases upon. So some of the things that changed are configuration properties, the Gradle plugin, and the Actuator endpoints. And we can go through each one to see what's changed. So configuration properties. For those of you who don't know, Spring Boot gives you the opportunity to externalize your configuration into properties files or the environment so that you can run the same application in different environments. And in Spring Boot 1.x, we supported relaxed binding. So we would allow you to write the same property in many different ways. So you could either write it with a hyphen or camel case or an underscore, and it would that property would still bind to the same bean. We still support relaxed binding in 2.0. It's just that we've changed the way you can read properties from the environment, and also how you specify some properties in certain property sources, such as the environment variables. So if you see here, this relaxed binding, the my.foo.hello world, like I just said, it will all bind to my foo hello world with all lowercase and with the special characters removed. So that's what we call as relaxed binding. But when you're reading the properties from the environment, it's now consistent. So there's a uniform format for doing that, and what you do is all the elements are separate. So this first one that you see here, my foo hello-world, so it's all lowercase. The words are alphanumeric. You can use a hyphen to separate the word so that it's readable. And
yeah, I mean, so the basic difference here is you can think of one as like how you can specify it in your properties file, and we're trying to be as flexible as possible there. But what we're trying to do is tighten up the rules that you should use within your own code. So within your own code, if you're getting an environment variable directly from Spring's environment interface, you should use that lowercase dot dash format. And if you do that, basically things should work perfectly fine. Even better is to use configuration properties, like have a dedicated class that we do the binding for you, and then you don't need to worry about any of this.
The other thing that's changed in configuration properties is how you can specify your properties in environment variables. So because environment variables, you can't use dot as your separator. We've started supporting that using, sorry, I also mean dot and the array indexes. You can't use that in your environment variables. So we now support that with underscores. So if you want to specify indexes in your environment variables, you can use underscores. So this first one here, my underscore var underscore 1, will actually be my dot var of 1. And the same thing you can do with multiple indices. So it's just a convenient way to specify your environment variables. There's also consistent behavior for collections now. In Spring Boot 1.x, there was some kind of confusion between the way lists would get bound to your configuration properties. Like sometimes if you specified a list in your YAML file, sometimes it would override whatever you'd specified in another property source. Sometimes it would merge it. So the rules were
relaxed.
Yeah,
too relaxed.
They were too relaxed. So we've tried to improve that in 2.0. And should we show that demo first, or do you?
We can finish this slide. There's just, I guess, a couple more points. We have, some slightly better types are available to us now. Now that I said we've raised the baseline to Java 8, we have things like Java X duration. So any kind of time-based property is now specified using a duration in the code, and that means that we can have a nice little converter class to represent, to parse strings. So you can now specify durations as like 1s for 1 second, rather than having to put like 1000 and guessing that it might be milliseconds or it might be something else. So we've overhauled kind of the complete, any property now that specifies a time uses a duration type. And there's also origin support, so we can tell all the way through where a particular property comes from now, right down to the line and column number within the properties file or the YAML file. And there's a few features that we're making use of that at the moment in Boot 2, but it's really about laying the groundwork so we can do some more kind of exciting stuff in the future. And especially we're thinking IDE support could benefit from this. You'd be able to know like exactly where in your code this property came from, right down to the kind of line and column number.
Right, and we've got a short demo for how the behavior for collections is now consistent in 2.0 and how it's different from what it was in 1.x. Okay. Okay, so this is the 1.x application that I have here. Let's just take a quick look at the POM. It's using 1.5.9 release. And again, I have a list of commits lined up, so we just go through those one by one. The code will be available later. So this test here, what it's doing is it's trying to get the hello properties bean and then asserting on the foo property from that bean. And if we just look at hello properties real quick, it has this annotation, the add configuration properties annotation from Spring Boot. So that's always been there. And with a prefix of hello. And this foo thing is a list of strings. And it has a default value of A and B. Now, if we want to override that default value in our application.yaml, and I'm using the YAML list syntax here. So I would expect in my test that because I've overridden it in my YAML file, it should now contain just C and not the default values. But if I run this test, it fails because oh, I'm sorry, it's small, but I'll just say what it failed on. It says that the actual values that it got were C and B. So it kind of did some weird merging where it replaced just the first item in the default value. So it just replaced A, and it still left B in there, whereas we just wanted to completely override the list and use C. But if I switch to 2.0, it's basically the same test. And in my application.yaml, I've still got the YAML list, which has just one element, which is C, and hello property still has, oops, sorry. Hello property still has the default values for A and B. But in 2.0, just a quick look at the POM, we're using 2.0.0 build snapshot, so it's the latest version that's out there right now. If I run the test, that works, and that's kind of more intuitive because what we specified in our properties file, that's sort of the source of truth, and we want that to reflect in our configuration properties.
Yeah, this bug has hit, well, I'm not sure if I'd call it a bug. This feature in 1.5 has been raised more than once, but it turned out to be quite a difficult problem to fix because in 1.5 we were making use of binding features that were really meant for Spring MVC, and we kind of abused them a little bit. So in 2.0 we've had to kind of go from a ground up and rewrite the entire binding logic.
Right, and the other thing that was confusing in 1.x was now if I change that same YAML file to instead use a comma separate, I just have one element so there's no commas, but instead of a regular YAML list, if I used a comma separated list, it behaves differently in 1.x. Like now if I run this test, it's actually green. So depending on how you specified the property in your YAML file, 1.x would behave differently for lists, which was also confusing to a lot of users. But 2.0, even if we change to the comma separated list, behaves in the same way, where it completely overrides the list. So the test is still green.
So that's one workaround if you're still on 1.5 is to specify them all as a single element.
The next thing that we have is in 1.x, we didn't support binding to sets. So what you see here, well, using YAML list to bind to sets. So again, I've got the YAML list format here, and I've updated hello properties with another property, which is a set of strings, so it's called bar. And in this test here, if I get bar, I would expect that it has cat, dog, and bird because that's what I've set in my properties file. But in 1.x, that wasn't possible. And it says, it throws basically an invalid property exception because it couldn't bind to the set. 2.0. So I've got the same set, bar. And the same test again. And in 2.0, binding, let me just show you the YAML file. So it's still a YAML list. And that works as expected. So now you can, in 2.0, you can actually use a YAML list to bind to sets.
Again, that's a bug that, a feature that people have complained about in the past. It is quite confusing in 1.5 to not be able to use a set if you've actually got a set as your underlying source of truth.
Again, this next commit is basically the same thing where in 1.x, using a YAML list for binding to the set didn't work. But if you used a comma-separated list, it would work. So again, just an example of the inconsistency in what we had in 1.x. And the last thing that I want to show here is the new origin support that Phil talked about. So if you have the, well, we've added the origin support as part of the configuration properties feature. And right now in Spring Boot, we're consuming it in our environment endpoint. So we have the actuator dependency. I'm just going to go to 2.0 because that's where the feature is added.
Who, out of interest, who uses YAML and who uses properties? YAML first? Okay.
Oh, wow.
And properties? So I'd actually say YAML almost takes it there, like just barely, but it's kind of interesting.
Right, so we've added the actuator dependency to get the environment endpoint, and that will basically give you, show you your property sources and the properties that came from that property source. So if we look at the env endpoint, yes, Spring Boot starter actuator was the one. So small.
Oh, yeah. We got a JSON pretty far.
No. Guess I could use.
Command plus might make it a bit bigger.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the output of the actuator's env endpoint. And as you can see here, it has the property source. So all these properties came from the system properties. And for your application.properties files and your application.yaml, what? Did I run 2.0? Oh, it's weird.
That is weird.
Let me just go back here. Yeah, I don't see application.yaml.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there it is.
Can make that a bit
Okay, I'll
bigger.
just copy that bit. Yeah.
Okay, this format is not particularly readable, but you can see
How
at the
you-
bottom.
Yeah. So this is the application.yaml's property source, and you can see that we now have support for the new origin field. So it tells you exactly which line number and which column number the properties that we've added have come from. So hello.bar, if you have multiple property sources which specify hello.bar, this can be useful in showing you which ones do that and where exactly it's been specified in your file.
Are there any questions? Before? Yeah, go on.
Let's say you have properties that aren't on the new rules. What would happen? Would it be like ignored or error or some sort of warning?
Could you repeat that? If you have properties that aren't on what?
So you have like those new rules, like it all has to be lowercase. So let's say you have like a property like camel case.
Right. Okay. So the question is, I've got an existing app that I'm upgrading, and I've gone through and that it's using camel case. So it depends on where that property is specified. So if it's in the actual like application properties file or the application YAML, that's just fine. It will read as it always did. So if you have like server port with it being capital S and capital P but no underscore, it's absolutely fine. We still respect that and bind it to the class. The difference is if you're writing your own code, and I think most people probably won't necessarily even have this problem, but if you look through some of the Spring Boot code in 1.5, you may find this kind of, there's often a little bit of logic where we're doing this relax binder thing and we create it, and that's to like get a value back out and support the relax names. And a lot of people miss the kind of subtleties there. They say, oh, I'll get it in the format exactly as I've specified, and that works, but then they want to override it in an environment variable, and of course it's all uppercase, and that doesn't work. So the new way of doing it is if you just follow those rules of being kind of lowercase and dot when you get it back out in your code, then again, everything should just work. You don't need to kind of do anything magic, or you don't need to remember to call the relaxed binder service like you did in 1.5.
Are there warnings when you have the old spelling?
No, there aren't warnings.
Maybe reactive with a relational database?
Question is, can I be reactive with a relational database? And the answer, I believe, is probably not, because most of the relational databases currently don't offer reactive support. I think maybe Postgres has a reactive driver that you can use, but I'm not sure that Spring Data have actually done that yet. And if you're talking about JPA, then the answer is definitely not currently, because there's no way of not having a blocking API with JPA currently. Any other questions?
Version 1 wasn't trimming white space on environment variables. Is it trimming now?
Question is, version 1 didn't used to trim white space on environment variables, and does version 2? I think so. I think it does. If it doesn't, we should fix it. So please raise an issue if you try the latest snapshot and it doesn't work. Yeah, that was I think that's part of the consistency that we're trying to bring with 2.0. And we do realize that some of the upgrade to 2.0 might be a little bit painful, hopefully not too painful, but in the long run, these kind of little inconsistencies can really bite you. So I believe it does trim white space, and if it doesn't, we'll fix it.
What were the motivations for adding the origin fields to debugging, tooling, you can actually use it to look up certain things like precedence order?
Should I answer that? Do you want to answer that?
The motivation to add origin support. So the question was, what was the motivation to add origin support? Well, we were developing the new configuration properties binder, and then we were like rewriting the YAML loader and the properties loader. And just as part of that, we thought we could add origin support to this thing where we can show you the exact line number that this thing came from. So I think it was mostly for debugging purposes and for other tools to use it in.
Yeah, I mean, the Actuator endpoint, I think, is particularly useful because often if you have, especially if you combine properties with profiles, it can be a little bit like easy to not really know where this value came from. So a lot of it was about giving us this traceability. And a lot of the work we're doing in Boot 2 is kind of, it's kind of a boring, exciting release. Like, we're working on a lot of the groundwork that we know we can build on in the future, and origin support is just something that if we put in now, even if we don't expose it in many places currently, it gives us a lot of potential to do things like with tooling. You can imagine, you know, looking at an actuator endpoint in your IDE and clicking and boom, straight to the properties file and straight to the line number that thing's declared at.
I'm a bit confused about the reason. Should I shift from my Tom server to the net server if I want to use non-blocking I/O?
So the question is, do I have to shift to the non?
What are the benefits of switching?
What are the benefits of switching to a non-blocking? It's kind of a big subject to go into. I really suggest you go and see Rosen's talk. He's probably good. I mean, you can.
No, I was just going to say, if you want to switch to a non-blocking application, you don't have to switch to Netty. So that's the default that comes with WebFlux. But you can easily like change your application's dependencies to still use Tomcat. It'll use the non-blocking parts of the Servlet 3.1 API. So you can still use Tomcat in a non-blocking application. But why is Netty the default? That Rosen would probably answer that better.
We'll move on for a bit, and can we take some more questions at the end, if that's okay? Otherwise, I'm worried we might not get through all the demos and stuff. I think this is me. Okay.
Yep.
So who uses Gradle? Okay. Everyone else using Maven? Anyone using Ant? We do have ANT support, you know. Someone contributed it. So the Gradle plugin has been changed quite significantly. Again, it's one of those things where we thought we kind of knew what we were doing, and we wrote this Gradle plugin, and we tried to do a lot with it. And as people tried to customize what they wanted to do with Gradle plugin, it became clear that we'd kind of broken some of the Gradle rules. So the new Gradle plugin is much more kind of idiomatic Gradle. It has the old boot repackage task, which used to take a jar and kind of convert it into a fat jar, has been replaced by 2 new tasks, one called boot jar and one called boot war. These tasks no longer kind of figure out what they're going to do. They're much more stupid, and we let Gradle do the figuring out for us, which actually means it's much more customizable for you. We also don't have, I think before we applied the dependency management plugin on your behalf, and now when you upgrade, you'll need to declare that you want to use the dependency management plugin as well, which is one extra line in your Gradle file, but we think it's actually clearer and hopefully not going to cause too much upgrade pain for people. Actuator endpoints. So, is this me? Am I green or? We've got
I
this
don't know
really.
what a color code.
We put this really great idea. The number in the corner of that slide changes color depending on who's supposed to speak.
Really
but I made
tiny.
I made it so subtle that we can't actually tell. Is that white or green?
I think it's
It's on you.
So yeah, the actuator endpoints, as we saw before, we have the Spring Boot actuator dependency, which gives you the ability to manage and monitor your application using these endpoints called health, env, info, and there are a bunch of others that come out of the box. And we did quite a bit of overhaul to the infrastructure that the actuators were built on top of. So I think I'm going to go through the demo first and then talk about these.
Yeah, okay.
Right, so let me close the configuration properties.
Has anyone written their own actuator endpoint? A few? Okay, so
In 1.x or 1.x?
you might have some work to do.
So in this, let me check out to
The good news is if you migrate your code to use this new infrastructure, you'll get free support for Jersey and WebFlux and WebMVC. So.
Right, so in 1.x, this is the 1.x version, and then I have a 2.0 version. It's using 1.5.9 release, and as you can see here, we have the actuator dependency in our form. So if you wanted to write your own actuator in 1.x, we had this class, the endpoint interface, which you'd have to implement or extend the abstract endpoint class. And that had one method which you could override, which was the invoke method. And if that was all you wanted, that's fine. So I won't run this commit, but in the next one, now let's say I want to extend this endpoint to have another method or another mapping. So in an MVC world, I might want one to have a get mapping and one, the same endpoint to have a post mapping. So I added this method here called set some value. I'm not actually going to go and set a value for the purpose of the demo. It's just going to log the value that you give it. But I mean, as you can tell, adding this method is not going to do anything here in 1.x because nothing is really using that method. So what you had to do was, it was a little tedious because you had to write technology-specific extensions so that you could use that method to as a post mapping in the MVC case. So we had like a abstract endpoint MVC adapter if you wanted to expose that over MVC. And as you can see, it has a post mapping which calls the delegate, which is the endpoint in this, the example endpoint in this case, and it calls set some value on that. And then if you wanted the same thing for JMX, you would have to basically write another JMX adapter and implement set value, calling your delegates set method. Should we run that, or?
No,
As you can see, that's a little tedious because you have to write separate adapters for the technology that you want to expose that endpoint on. But in 2.0, what we've done is we've tried to simplify it quite a bit by giving you this endpoint annotation, which takes an ID. And I believe that's what it uses as the path by default, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, it's for an MVC endpoint, it's going to map to /example. And we have these new technology independent operations that you can specify. So we have the read operation, the write operation, and we also have a delete operation. So once we do that, we don't actually have to go ahead and write all these adapters for exposing the same endpoint over MVC or JMX. It will just work using these annotations. So I'll just show you real quick. So if you can see here in this tiny font, we have all the actuators that are mapped, and one of them is the example one that we've added. So by default now, we've changed the path that the actuators, the context path for the actuators to be /actuator. And there were a number of reasons for that, actually. It was to group all the actuators under one context path, and also in 1.x, we had them at the root level, so that could potentially clash with your application's request mappings. So we've now put them under /actuator, but if you want to go back and change it to the root, you can always configure the context path property and change it back.
That's also another, like, one of these things about setting the future up is we know now that we can add more actuator endpoints, and we don't have to worry quite so much about the fact we might be clashing with endpoints that you might have declared in your own application.
Right. And what we just saw was we could have the same endpoint exposed over MVC and JMX without adding any adapters. But what if you did want your MVC endpoint to behave slightly differently from your JMX endpoint? So how do you do that? And for that, we've provided these technology-specific extensions. So I have this class here, which is an extension of the example endpoint. And by extension, I mean you can put this annotation called endpoint web extension. We have a similar one for JMX called endpoint JMX extension, I think. And then we can use the read operation, because I want to change the way the read operation behaves for my web endpoint. And I've just, instead of returning the example endpoint was doing hello world, I wanted to change the behavior of the web endpoint to do like hello web world. So that should be fairly straightforward with these extensions that we have here. I don't think I'm going to run that one either, unless anybody wants to see it in action. And the last bit that we have here is support for Jersey out of the box. How many, does anyone use Jersey? Okay. So instead of Spring Boot Startup Web, I'm now using Spring Boot Startup Jersey. So the application is going to start up on Jersey. And you don't have to do anything special to get the app running. I mean, the actuators running on Jersey. You can just start up the application. And the actuators should just be available as always. So env is available. That's health, which gives you the health of the application. So you can just drop in the dependency, change, use Jersey, and it still works the same. Anything you want to add to that?
Oh, yeah, go on.
That's
This thing? Oh, so that's actually the health actuator endpoint for my Spring Boot application. So I added the actuator dependency to the application, and that gives me this endpoint.
There's a whole bunch of them. If you check out the docs, there's like a whole bunch that we provide for free. I think only health and info are open at the moment, but the rest you can kind of switch on. So like all the environment variables, or what are my configuration properties, or what's the status of my app, and there's a whole bunch of them that you can check out the docs.
There's health and info. Currently, I don't have any info configured for my application.
Lots of people put the git like char in there, so if you've like doing a continuous deploy type thing, you can always hit info and go, oh, that's the actual, version of the app.
It is the same reason why the endpoint annotation doesn't automatically include all the annotation on it?
The question is there any particular reason why endpoint doesn't include the components? Yeah, I think the answer to that is it's possible, I believe, to use those annotations on bean definitions in your configuration class, I think. I'm not sure, to be honest. We'd have to check with Andy on that.
And also, we only create the endpoint bean conditionally in the auto configuration.
Oh, yes.
Depending on whether, so you could disable a specific endpoint and we won't create the bean in that. So because it's conditional in our auto configuration, we create the bean there. I don't know if that's...
No, yeah, I think it's mainly because it's probably primarily because we define everything in configuration classes, so we probably haven't really thought about people using it directly themselves as much. It might be worth raising an issue for that, and we'll discuss it on GitHub.
Okay. So just a summary of the actuator endpoints. We now have the endpoint annotation, and then also the web endpoint and JMX endpoint annotations if you just want that endpoint for a specific technology. There's tech-independent operations, so instead of adding adapters for MVC and JMX, you can just use the read operation, write operation, and delete operation annotations. And there's also tech-specific extensions for extending that endpoint to behave differently for a specific technology. So we have endpoint web extension and endpoint JMX extension. It also works fluently with Spring MVC, Jersey, and Spring WebFlux. You might be wondering, like the health endpoint, which we just showed you, that gathers information from these things called health indicators. So we have a number of health indicators out of the box. Like we have disk space health indicator, Redis health indicator, I think. So how does that work in the reactive world? Because these health indicators now need to return a mono of health instead of health. So we have new reactive health indicators, and you can also add your own reactive health indicators by implementing that.
What color are we? Are we green? Oh, no, it's white. Yeah, it's green. Okay. So a little bit about what's evolving. There is some, most of what we've shown you here is kind of in a fairly complete state, we think. There's a few things that are still kind of evolving and changing, and you've still got time to get your feedback in if you want to. The first one I want to talk about is metrics. So who uses metrics in Boot 1.5? A few people, quite a few. Okay, so in Boot 2.0, we are going to defer to a new library called Micrometer. So Micrometer is being developed by Pivotal. It's not really a Spring exclusive project. It's a general purpose metrics project, a bit like DropWizard metrics. It's primarily, its primary difference between kind of DropWizard metrics and the Spring Boot 1.5 metrics is it's multi-dimensional, which means you can kind of tag things. So it's possible to kind of cut and slice your metrics and look at specific features, like give me all the failures in a particular data center. It has like a facade over a bunch of different monitoring systems, Prometheus, and a whole bunch of other ones that I can't remember. And you should go and see John's talk on this subject on Thursday at
At
10:30. So if you want to learn more about the kind of guts of Micrometer, go and talk to John. I would just mention briefly as well that some of the, this I think will cause a little bit of upgrade pain for people. If you're currently logging your own metrics, you may need to adapt to this new API, and you'll have to expect a slightly different format in the JSON that we're returning as well.
Okay, that's me. So yeah, one of the other things we've been changing as part of Spring Boot 2.0 is the security, and more specifically the security auto configuration that comes with boot by default. So if you add Spring Boot starter security to your Spring Boot application, previously we would like configure all these rules for your Spring Boot application where we'd say, okay, so we're going to secure your application with basic auth, but we're going to have some different rules for, like, you can configure your actuator endpoint slightly differently. So you can have info and health enabled, but all the other actuators are going to be secure. And the way we did that was using multiple of these web security configurer adapters. And a lot of times we saw that people were having ordering issues with them. So they'd want to turn off Spring Boot's default basic auth security, but maybe like leave the actuator security on, and then they would see that their custom web security configurer adapter was failing because the ordering was all messed up. And so what we've tried to do in Boot 2.0 is really simplify the auto configuration that comes out of the box for you. So, and the best default for security we think is to have everything secured by default. So if Spring Security is on the class path, we don't have any special logic around, oh, we won't secure something and we won't secure something else, or we will secure something else. The only thing that we got as feedback was leave the info actuator and the health actuator open by default, because a lot of automated systems hit the health endpoint to get the status of the application. So that's one rule that's in place. But other than that, it's very simple. And once you want to configure your own security and have the Spring Boot default back off, all you need to do is add your own web security configurer adapter, and Spring Boot's defaults will back off. So there's no like ordering issues you see because of the multiple web security configurer adapters. We've also tried to provide some convenience methods using request matchers for static resources and your actuators. So in your custom security configuration, you can use these request matchers and be like, okay, so a request to health should be permit all. So hopefully that'll be easier to customize in your configuration. And the next thing is actually, we've changed the OAuth 2.0 support in Spring Boot 2.0. So Joe Granja, who's working on the Spring Security OAuth support in Spring Security 5, he's here at the back. So we've moved to Spring Security 5.0 OAuth support now. And what that gives us is, it gives us support for multiple client registrations. So in your configuration property, in your application.properties file or your application, wherever you specify your configuration, you can actually specify multiple OAuth clients with different client ID, client secret, and redirect URIs, etc. The one thing for people who are using Spring Boot 1.x's resource server support or authorization server support, that has now been moved out of boot, and right now we just have support for the OAuth client. But I believe resource server support and the auth server support is coming in a future release of Spring Security. So once it's in Spring Security, we will add it to boot 2.x. But if you are using the resource server support and you migrate to boot 2.0, you might have to do some of the things that Spring Boot 1.x would do for you manually. Or I think there are also plans to take that code that was in in Spring Boot 1.x and maintain a separate library for it. So you might be able to use that library. Is that right, Joe? Right, so he said it's top priority after this conference to take the resource server support that was in Spring Boot 2.0 and move it to a separate place.
And this is another one of those ones that it was a kind of difficult decision to make because we know we're taking something that was previously quite convenient if you were doing server or resource server support, and we're making it slightly less convenient. But if we didn't take it out of Boot 2, it would be kind of hard for us to take it out later. So we made the kind of difficult decision to have really good client support in 2.0 and then add this back in 2.1 and hopefully give people enough to kind of bridge the wait.
Okay, I think that's all we have.
A few minutes for questions, I guess, if anyone wants. Yeah, question here. So I think the question is about the origin support. Does it just tell you like the so the origin support is about where is this property from? It's kind of vague, and there we have various subclasses of origin basically. So one of them is a resource. It'll say I'm in the class path at this file, and then another part of that is the line and column number. So it depends on where the thing actually came from, but the actual interface is kind of simple. It's just like print me a description of where this thing's from. So for instance, it might say I'm from the environment, and then we don't have much to go on other than I'm from an environment variable. Whereas if it's from a YAML file, we can say, I'm from this file and this line number and this column number. Question here?
So what if the property value is, say, from Spring Cloud Config Server?
So the question is, what if the properties are from Spring Cloud Config Server? I guess at some point, Spring Cloud Config Server will be able to add origin support to give as much information, like the Git repo perhaps. But currently, I don't know. You'd have to speak to someone from Spring Cloud.
So I mean, if you have multiple web security configurator adapters in your own code, and you've made sure that they're ordered properly, you wouldn't have to change that. This is the default web security configurator adapter that Spring Boot would add, and then we'd find users surprised that their customized ones weren't getting priority. So if you have it in your own code, that should be fine.
I think we're about time, so maybe if there's any other, I just want to call it in case people want to get off, but if there's any other questions, come up and talk to us afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.